There we go. Kia ora and welcome everyone. Good afternoon from all over New Zealand. My name is Natalie and I'm from Grow, and we're very excited to be able to offer online workshops in these challenging, crazy, funny times. And we're very, very fortunate that we've got some great presenters who are joining us in these online webinars, who are actually presenting the online webinars. We're just putting them on, and then the glory really goes to all our presenters. We've done 3 or 4 webinars so far, and they've all been very well received, and I'm pretty sure you will get a lot of value out of this one as well. We've asked Robin Cabral, who's originally from the USA but is currently living in Australia, to present for us a free webinar on fundraising, and in particular crisis fundraising, because a lot of you are doing fantastic work, but because of the situation we're in, your fundraising has got to change somehow. And so we've asked Robin to give you all some tips. So I'm going to hand you over to Robin now. Robin?
Great. Thank you so very much, Natalie. Well, I am going to take my video off after I share my screen and load up my PowerPoint here, if you don't mind. I just want you focusing on the content. How does that sound?
Wonderful.
Let's just see. Hopefully I can stop my video, and there we go. How's that?
That is wonderful. And if anyone, sorry, Robin, before we really dive into it, if anyone got any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. There will be some moments where we can discuss some of the questions.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started with crisis fundraising. What will happen next? As Natalie was saying, a little bit about myself. I am owner of Development Consulting Solutions, and I currently have clients in the United States and Australia. And I split my time, believe it or not, although lately, because of this pandemic, I find myself here in Australia for the duration. I have over 25 years working for and with nonprofits, both as a fundraiser as well as a consultant. And I specialize in providing coaching services for nonprofits, to small nonprofits, to get them started with their first fundraising efforts and campaigns. And I'm really on a mission to transform organizations by having effective philanthropy. So here's what we're going to look at today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the current fundraising climate and what we're seeing. I was in the epicenter of the Australian bushfires and have some research based upon what happened to charities after the bushfire, looking at some donor motivations and what we can expect and what we should be doing today. And while I wish I had a crystal ball, and I wish that I could say that I have been through anything similar to this in the past, I have not. I don't think any of us have. I will share what we think the philanthropic or the fundraising landscape may look like in the future. So COVID-19, I've had a lot of experience with COVID-19. I have over 40 coaching clients a month, and when COVID-19 hit, we didn't know what to expect, but I'm going to share with you what we are finding and seeing. So how is COVID-19 impacting charities today? Well, in a variety of ways, right? We're seeing it's impacting really private donations. We're seeing it impacting events. We're seeing it impacting grants and foundations and trusts. And I'm going to go through how it's impacting each of those in a little bit. And then some op shops and social enterprise, and then even some museum, theater tickets, and events and revenue streams. So how is COVID-19 impacting charities? Well, what we're seeing is some funding cuts. We're seeing funding diverted to essential services. We're seeing furloughs, layoffs, stand-downs, some just overall anxiety and low morale. And maybe even in the future, some organizations even going out of business. Now, what do we know about downturns? There are a few things that we know about downturns, and we're seeing a lot of them, particularly in the United States with systems that are failing. So we see that during downturns that organizational weaknesses are exposed, right? We see a lot of poor practices. We see where neglect has happened. And certainly organizations do not have that big capital or access to it. So here's a great quote. It now seems clear that many charities won't survive without financial support from government or from philanthropy. And most charities and fundraisers will struggle, and a lucky few will probably be okay. That about sums it up. So, the Australian bushfire crisis is, it's a crisis that is like many other crises that have happened in the past. I will say that COVID-19, or how I like to say the coronavirus, is affecting each and every single one of us. And I'll talk about how that is translating to donors. But what we did find during the Australian bushfire crisis, number one, I'll have to say, United States, we think, we have the most generous donors, but in fact, Australian and New Zealanders are among the most generous in the world. And so when the bushfires happened, we began to examine what is the role of private philanthropy, individual donors. If you can remember past these pandemic days, that there was an influx of private philanthropy to the bushfire crisis. And then the question of, well, what role does the government play in all of this? And then there was the emergence of these new fundraising platforms like Celeste Barber's Facebook fundraiser that we had happen. What we did find during the Australian bushfire crisis, and what we learned, and this is not just the Australian bushfire crisis, but all kinds of natural crises and other crises in the past, is that there was what we call expanded giving. So donors continue to give to their favorite causes while also donating to the disaster relief efforts at hand, but not redirecting. So appeals using multiple fundraising channels had a higher average overall donation. Digital pulled heavily. We saw that multi-million-dollar donations came from, of course, corporates and big celebrities and philanthropists all across the world. This one is very interesting, and we're seeing it happen right now during COVID-19, is that new donors came forth, and I call them the one-time disaster donors, right? We did see that giving dropped to traditional charities, but that was only had a short-term impact. Now, there was a lot of controversy around how donors expected their money to be used, right, immediately. And so thanking and updating was important. And certainly being authentic with the administrative costs, if you remember the Red Cross here, so being transparent with what it actually costs to provide the services. And certainly non-disaster frontline charities still need to fundraise, but must acknowledge the distress. So that was actually done from a report that was compiled here in collaboration with the Fundraising Institute of Australia and a consulting firm called More Strategic Fundraising, Public Attitudes to Bushfire Fundraising. And you can actually download a copy of that report. What is most important is that giving is really an antidote to powerlessness or making a difference on the ground. And that's exactly what we are seeing today with the coronavirus and COVID-19. This is a great quote from Philanthropy Australia, where it says, unlike other types of funding and support, philanthropy, private donations can step back and wait to see what is needed after the first collective support from the community and the government is deployed. Philanthropy can identify those gaps in resources, identify areas for further or different support, and channel funding to support those communities and people who fall outside the system response. So really, philanthropy is that nimble agent that can come in when government and other sources of funding cannot, and fill in those areas. And so it has become critically important, both in the United States and throughout the world, that philanthropy is actually taking center stage during this current crisis that we're all in. I will say this, I also do some work for and we'll get into this in a moment, but I do some work for a company in America called Network for Good, and it's the largest payment processor of Facebook donations. And what they have stunningly seen as they process donations from the back end of Facebook, as well as a coaching program and their software, is that donations during the month of April were up 90% same time last year. So the giving response has been absolutely phenomenal. And so we stop and we ask ourselves, what is motivating donors to give right now? So the first part is if you're not fundraising, you should be, right? But what is motivating donors to give? Well, what we know about donors is that donors don't give to organizations, they give to help people. They give to solve problems. They give to solve unmet needs. So during this particular crisis, what we're finding is that donors are feeling like they want to do something to help, right? They want to be part of the solution. They want to take control. I think for me, when I have spoken to a lot of not-for-profits, is they've said to me is that, you know, we've all felt out of control in some respects during this whole crisis, during the stay-at-home orders. You know, we still feel out of control. Somewhat, New Zealand, you are doing very well with containing the virus, but in America, not so great, right? So folks are still feeling like they're helpless, and there's a lot of division in the country. So donors are using that energy to take control. This is an area that they can feel that they have an impact on the outcome, whereas right now, donors are not feeling that as much. Now, I say this, unless you ask, people won't think you need help, right? And so what we're finding is that the groups that are asking presently are getting the help. The groups that are not asking are not getting the help. It's obvious. So donors have said, you know, why would I stop giving to my favorite charity? And now, you know, even though we see that there is this reallocation of funding going towards the front lines, medical, elderly, children, donors are wanting to give to both to the front lines and um, to their favorite charity. Now, I will say this, you know, being on the front lines of this as a fundraiser and coaching clients, when this first broke back in March, I just told my fundraising clients to just allow the frontline fundraisers or frontline organizations to fundraise. However, that quickly was adjusted because we were finding that donors were giving to all sorts of causes, not just frontline charities. Their favorite groups for the first time were under severe financial duress, right? Like many events have been canceled. Social enterprise activities have stopped because of stay-at-home orders and closures. So donors are really responding to the fact that even though their charity wasn't on the front line, they were still suffering through this crisis. There has really truly been an outpouring of humanity. If I can say, where have I seen the greatest points of light throughout this whole crisis, it has been in the fact that donors have really risen to the occasion to really support those charities that they favor. Most donors are presently saying that they don't plan to make any changes to their giving, and some have indicated they would consider donating to a new charity helping people affected by the coronavirus. If others had to reduce support or switch away from supporting existing charities they perceive as not directly coronavirus related. It's a tongue twister. So donors are really saying charitable giving allows people to exert a sense of control in a world that is otherwise spinning. How many of us have personally felt that way over the last 2 months or more, right? Like we have had no control over what to expect, and we still don't. We do not know what will happen in 2 months from now with the pandemic. We do not know what will happen in 6 months from now. And so this really has been a way for donors to say, this is one thing that I can make a difference in the world today. And I think that's been the most important finding. The other thing that is very, very different from this crisis, as opposed to, let's say, the Australian bushfire crisis, is that we are all in this together. No one is immune from the impacts of the coronavirus, or as opposed to the Australian bushfires that might have been happening in southeastern south coast New South Wales, and part of Queensland as well, and Victoria. And maybe that smoke and that fire was drifting over to New Zealand and making some days pretty cloudy. We weren't all the time directly impacted. In this case, we are directly impacted by this. Many of us are fearful for our health and our lives and our loved ones. So we are all living this crisis together. And that's why this has made such a powerful motivation for donors out there. So I've covered a lot of information really, really quickly because I want to get into what should we be doing about this, which is, I'm sure, what you're all wondering, what next steps should be taken. But before we segue into kind of what we can expect, I wanted to check in with Natalie to see if we have any questions up to this point.
So far, thank you, Robin. No, so far we have only had the question, will the presentation be available afterwards? And the answer is yes. Robin has kindly shared her slides with us, so we will share those around. And also, we're recording this session and loading it up on YouTube and our Facebook page, and you will get the link from that in the email afterwards, hopefully later today. But I haven't seen any questions just yet. It's either all clear or people are still processing it. But there will be another moment when Robin will pause to answer any questions. So if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat box.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Natalie. I appreciate that. All right, so let's continue. Whoops, let's go forward instead of backward. All right, so here's what we can expect. What I'm sharing with you here, this slide came from a fundraising consultancy in the United States called the Better Fundraising Company. And we have been circulating this particular diagram for some weeks now. This diagram is really the only roadmap, and you can print this out, or if anyone's interested, I can send this to Natalie, and I actually have the PDF of the whole document that I can send along to Natalie. So just type into the chat box whether or not you'd like this sent out with the slides, and I can send that over today. But it's been really helpful. I've had a lot of organizations share this with their boards of directors and share this with others to get a sense of what we are projecting to happen both now and into the foreseeable future. Now, I will preface and say that this slide is based upon previous economic slumps, like the global financial crisis that happened in 2008 and 2009, as well as other natural disasters. So it's a conglomeration or a synthesis of those particular points in history to kind of give us a sense of what we can expect next. And it really is living out as far as I can see. There are really 4 phases that this particular company is showing that will happen. Number 1 is phase 1. And I believe that we are presently still in this phase. I'm not sure how much longer as the economies start to open up and people go back to somewhat of a new sense of normalcy in their lives. And then there is phase two, which is concerning, and that is called the slump, right? The bump and the slump. And what we have noted is, if you can see that, I don't have my glasses on, but we're anticipating that, well, the bump was 2 to 4 weeks, but what we're finding is that that has gone on for much longer than that. It's almost been, well, about 2 months or so now. And so thus we're anticipating that the slump will extend out for a much longer period. Now you will see that there is a line going across, a dotted line, and that is the baseline of your organization's giving. The thick black line is an organization who has done really well with fundraising. That's where they can expect to see themselves. And then an organization that has basically stopped fundraising during this time and or has not really had good fundraising systems in place will see themselves in the dashed dotted line, the one that is kind of drooping far below. The third phase is the surge, and that's kind of the recovery phase, and giving can increase during that time, and eventually over a number of maybe perhaps even into next year beyond, we will see giving normalize, which is what we saw after the global financial crisis during 2008, 2009. Now, this is the mother of all downturns. Why? Because it's both a health crisis and it will be, at least in America, and I'm sure here in Australia as well as New Zealand, somewhat of a very strong economic crisis. We have had businesses that have been closed and will not reopen to the same capacity, and so we have seen jobs lost, tourism industry decimated to some extent, and how that will ripple through the rest of the economy. So, we believe that this whole process could take somewhere between 18 and 24 months, but we don't know, right? We don't know. And I say that all the time. I'm the last one to profess that I know that it's going to happen exactly in these 4 phases and exactly during this length of time. However, what we do know is that we will all be impacted in some way. So as we noted, this chart that you saw here has been adjusted. And what we do find is that the slump is really, because the bump has lasted longer, the bump and the slump, I love it. The slump is going to last longer than we anticipated. And so, there's been a number of things canceled, businesses shut. The economy will not be up to full speed for quite a number of months, right? So this is going to lengthen that slump out. We haven't seen this. I mean, we didn't see this kind of closure of wholesale economies or global economies, as a matter of fact, to this extent ever. So the good thing is that we're still in the bump. The company that I work for, Network for Good, has been monitoring processing of donations, as I mentioned. They are starting to see a slight decline in donations, but the bump is still there. So many of my clients have had record-breaking seasons. And so while we don't really want to call it record-breaking under these unfortunate circumstances, they have really raised significant amounts of dollars towards their missions when they particularly need it. So what can we expect? We do know that households who continue to gave consistently even under difficult economic conditions. What we found from the global recession or the Great Recession was that the biggest economic downturn, that was the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression. People didn't stop giving. While the dollar amount they gave may have changed, they didn't stop giving. So that's the most important piece there. Now, I will say that and I hate to keep referencing America, but they're just setting all kinds of records, and not the most pleasant kind. But last week alone, they hit 33.5 million unemployed, the second highest time since the Great Depression. So that gives you a sense of the global scope of how economies are being impacted and what kind of domino effect that will have. Now, I say for all of you out there on this webinar, it is important that to note that you must keep fundraising even during the recessionary periods. You will not have to be worried that your donors will completely stop giving. They may not give at the same amounts, but they will not stop giving to you. Giving is a habit. People give because it makes them feel good. There's something about it they found, endorphins and those kinds of things. People want to give to help out others. So even if the economy is hit hard, some people will not change their giving behaviors dramatically. We can expect that. I hate the word unprecedented. I wish I could see you all raise your hand and say, yes, ban the word unprecedented. How many times have we heard unprecedented in the last 2 months? So I hate to have it here. You know, I don't think that we can look back, like I said, at that graph and say things are going to happen exactly like we see them. We should not plan or act like this is the Great Recession of 2018. We really think because of the dual nature of health and economic and the magnitude of what is happening, that this is like once in 100-year kind of event. And it will take some time, but like everything, right? Like the growth is growing in the forests here. I'm in the epicenter of the bushfire territory, and unfortunately lived through that. Things are green again. Things are growing. We'll get through this. We know that giving is very resilient, both in the US and elsewhere. And being New Zealand and Australia, donors are very, very charitable. So here's what we should be doing. I would say if you haven't done anything yet, get off this webinar and act now. As I said, we're starting to see the trends of a downward slope as people start to open up slowly in their different stages. So it's absolutely essential that you act now, right? The bump is very short in comparison to the slump and the surge and the new normal. So you have a very short window to respond. We don't know when each of those phases will end. We do not know when the pandemic will end, but we need to invest in fundraising now, and we do not want to de-invest in fundraising. If someone says to you, let's get rid of that function that's costing us money, no, 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 you need to invest in fundraising at the moment. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides that are what we're seeing and what we should be doing, right? So what we're seeing, of course, we're on this webinar. I said to Natalie yesterday, I said, I'd rather be there in person. You know, if the day opens up when I can fly there and be there, I would rather have that. But it's forcing all of us to work remotely. We're seeing reduced schedules or maybe even diminished, or maybe some of us have been furloughed for that matter. Client services are being done remotely or even curtailed. A lot of healthcare places are going to telehealth, those kinds of things. We are seeing that folks are looking for leadership. They're looking for, and I'll talk about what you should be doing, but this is unprecedented times and unprecedented actions. So what should you be doing about your communications, particularly your donor communications during this time? Well, certainly increasing them. people want to see leadership more now than ever. That's why the Prime Minister is on Facebook doing lives or on TV every single day almost, because people are hungering to see leadership during those times. And that's the same thing for not-for-profit leadership. So live video. I have one client who is doing Facebook Lives every single day, tours of their facility, and putting their donate button in the Facebook Live. And she has gotten over 70 new donors. This is a small animal sanctuary, and over, I think it's close to $7,000 in approximately a week's time. And she's moving people from Facebook conversions to become donors. Things that people are looking for: Q&As, having Zoom sessions that are like virtual town halls, that you can meet with your donors, meet with your constituents, your family members, your participants, electronic direct mails. So increasing your pace of communication is so critical, right? And having what I call a COVID case for support. What's your problem that you're giving to donors to solve? For instance, we were scheduled to have 3 events. They've all been canceled or postponed. We are down revenue by $250,000. We need your support now. That is a COVID case for support right there. Well, talking about special events, how many of us have been reliant upon special events, and now so many of my clients are faced with not having their events at all. First it went to let's move it to June or July, and then now it's let's move it to, well, then it was September, October, and now some groups are even saying that events are off the table until 2021, because even if they can have events, are we all going to be walking around with our face masks, or we can't have rooms that are up to capacity because of restrictions, social distancing restrictions, whatever those may be. So events are certainly being canceled well into the future. Think about it like international travel. We don't know when we're going to be traveling internationally, do we? So think about that. We're really uncertain about events. So postponing or even canceling them, and there are ways of handling that by issuing refunds or asking participants if they can give their refund back to the organization as a donation, right? So ask for ticket refunds or contributions to support losses. Consider virtual events. Some of them are falling flat, I have to say that. Some of them are working really well. It all depends. And then, of course, and I'm going to talk about this in a future webinar on fundraising strategy that Grow is hosting, but looking at income diversification. Should we be relying on events as one of our only strategies? Now, what are we seeing with grants, foundations, trusts, those kinds of things? Well, they're quickly realigning their giving priorities, and they're releasing some of their restrictions. So programmatic monies, they're now going back to their groups, their organizations, and saying you can use that for whatever crisis related. And certainly foundations are funneling monies to frontline responders. Reporting is being eased and deadlines are being moved. The one thing that we have to be conscious of is that foundations, trusts, and so forth give money from their investments. So if the economy has dropped, there will be a lag, but you will probably also see that in the future with their giving. Here is what I recommend you should be doing. Checking in with foundations, determine if their giving priorities have changed, what their deadlines may be. They may have moved. What are some pending status requests that you have with them? Are there any new pools of funding available that you may be able to tap into? Maybe they can ease some of the restrictions and check in about some of those reporting deadlines. Now these op shops, right, of course they're closed, and they may have social distancing well into the future, and there's been a shift in supply chains. So really looking at how can social enterprise fill in gaps that are in the marketplace that social enterprise can fill in. So a number of places have been able to distribute food for folks or things of those nature, and whether or not you can access some business stimulus money that's becoming available really in every country. Individual donors. This is the donors who care about what you're doing, and this is where it's at. They are giving and giving in significantly large amounts. They want to be the solution to your problem. So check in with them. What we say is just number one, first, as a human being, make sure that they are okay throughout this whole pandemic, right? So number one, that's the most important thing. Now, what we have been finding is that when we do these check-in calls, donors have been asking us, how can they help? So be prepared to share with them what's happening with your organization and what your case for support is. And you'll find that many of them will give, right? Like without even being asked, but you can certainly ask them to help now. But also recommend that if you have any donors who have pledged you money, to go back and ask them if they can make those gifts now without restrictions as well, or if there has been some restricted gifts, that maybe those restrictions are eased. Now, our mid to lower level donors, those are our major donors, what I was just talking about, but our mid to lower level donors, what we're seeing is that they're going to give no matter the level, right? And we're seeing again with them that private philanthropy is unprecedented. It's just jumping off the roof. It's going through the roof is what I should say. And it's for everyone. It's not just for the first line responders, but you need to be able to clearly say how your organization is being impacted by COVID-19. So I would highly recommend that if you haven't already, create what we're calling an emergency appeal and get that out to your donors. And it should be in, of course, we're all confined to home, and our donors are afraid to go to the mailboxes because Lord knows if we can pick up the virus that way as well. I've heard that. So digital channels have been producing very well. So having a multi-channeled approach with electronic direct mail, text messaging, telephone, peer-to-peer, and having multiple follow-ups. I'm recommending to some clients that they send out multiple appeals. There's a lot going on in fundraising. So face-to-face, we know these are suspended. We can't be door knocking. We can't be out there on the streets. So there has been a tremendous loss of revenue to face-to-face programs. New donor acquisition has been impacted, and we're not sure, again, of when these restrictions are going to be eased. Telemarketing has come in full force as a potential alternative to face-to-face fundraising, as well as this new donor acquisition, taking it to more digital approaches, such as things like digital lead acquisition conversions. And then monthly, or as in Australia, we call regular giving, the monthly donors, sustainer donors, whatever you want to call them, we are seeing that some are canceling their direct debits. And so cancellations have been almost 41% higher over the same time last year, which is concerning. Again, donor acquisition into these programs has been dropping. However, I am recommending to my clients, because we are headed going into the slump, that you should be asking donors for monthly giving, because it is that monthly giving or that regular giving that is going to sustain your organization during the slump, a consistent stream of income. And if you can make the case that $40 a month will provide, a family with a supply of, food, or hay for the, and this is an actual client monthly need, bays of hail for the animal sanctuary, right? She's so concrete with her fundraising. It's so spot on. So putting that call out there in your appeals, whether as a PS or as one of the main drivers of your emergency appeal. And again, if folks are canceling their direct debits, have some, care and leniency. Maybe forgive them a month, or, for not canceling, give them a month where you're not going to take a direct debit. And if they do cancel, just remind them that you'll always be there for them when they decide that it's time for them to come back. Corporate support, we are seeing, You know, there's a fair percentage of giving to smaller to mid-sized nonprofits. Certainly profitability, because businesses are under pressure at this point, is, you know, is questionable, right? We don't know how these major disruptions to systems are going to impact or be impacting businesses well into the future. So we can only surmise that maybe perhaps giving levels could remain steady, but we're unsure. So, you know, I recommend that you appeal to corporate supporters who may be doing there are some folks, community corporate folks, who are doing really well during this crisis, right? So those are the folks that you certainly want to still be talking with. And those who have been shuttered, right, because of closures and social distancing, just want to check in and provide donor care and stewardship to them. Volunteering. This has impacted every systems within our organization. You know, the for-purpose sector has 1.2 million employees, and their wages account for 50% of the costs. Volunteers are hugely important, and they represent around a quarter of the full-time staff equivalent in our workforce. So there is a huge impact to our sector because folks cannot volunteer at the rate they were because of stay-at-home orders and forced closures and social distancing. So what do? You know, we're very uncertain. We're uncertain about how people are going to feel once the restrictions are lifted, about being out and about and being in crowds. Same thing with events, right? You know, will the virus come back? Will it not? Will there be resurgence of it? Will we have new models of volunteering emerge? That's quite possible. And certainly, will volunteers become involved in philanthropy one day, which is not customarily the case here in Australia? And I would assume the same in New Zealand. But is this a pivotal? People say this is a time to pivot. I say no, it's a time to change, to really look at our systems and how we have been operating and what can we change, what needs to change, and what are we going to take forward into the future. Of course, government support. We're seeing a lot of economic support and stimulus packages, and certainly some targeted support packages for the social sector and some at-risk groups, right? Community groups that are serving at-risk populations. Of course, I don't know if you use the word lobby here, but that's a very American term, lobby, right? Lobby our legislators, but advocate for continued support and perhaps increased support and stimulus funding as well. Here's what you should not do. Don't do any of these things, okay? Don't cost cut fundraising, especially taking care of your donors. That's like forgetting to, you know, not put in, like I'm saying here, failing to invest in seed corn for the next season if you're a farmer. Just do not cut back on that. You know, those who were front and center during the Great Depression with customers in the depths of crisis came out the other end in much better shape. What we do know is that if you stop fundraising right now, the odds are that you will not or may not survive this potential crisis. Hi, Natalie, any questions?
Yes, Robin, thank
Yay!
you. I've got 3 questions from Penny, who says, how do small organizations compete with larger organizations who can, for example, advertise on TV for donations? As a smaller organizations, we also have a small pool of donors, so we need to go outside this to cover our shortfall.
Yes.
Question 2 is, how do we do it without sounding grotesque? I've had 2 organizations I regularly donate to contact me, and I refuse both times based on their approach. And the third question is, how do we do this when we have more work with less funds, and so therefore less time and money to invest into getting more funds?
Yes, great questions. These are all from Penny.
Yes, these
Great
are all from Penny.
questions. Okay, I'm going to take number 2 first and say, Penny, if you could just type into the chat box, just to give me a sense of what was that group's approach to you, right? So I would be curious to know, what did they say? What was their messaging that you found grotesque? And then we can talk about that. How can we do more with less time? Not to sell the next webinar that you're hosting on fundraising strategy, but I think essentially what it comes down to is really looking at your strategy and saying, are we being truly effective with what we're doing? What's the return on investment? What is the impact that we're having with current strategies? And can we do something different that's going to have more of an impact? So really stopping and saying, okay, I get that you're trying to do more with less time, more pressure on you. What is going to be the best strategy for your organization in order to raise the most amount of money? I call it finding the key leverage areas with my clients. And most of my clients are small organizations, so we do look for what are those leverage areas to have the greatest impact. Now, small organizations competing against larger organizations, that gets back to, at some point, and that gets back to the fundraising strategy workshop, but donor acquisition should be always an important part of your fundraising strategy. And I know it's the last thing on our list, Penny, but really, without trying always to consciously build your donor base, it's naturally attritioning by 10 to 15% per year by people dying, choosing to move, what have you. And you're always going to be faced with fewer and fewer people to call on. I will say that it doesn't matter the size of your organization. Donors love who you are and what your mission is. And so it's appealing to your current donors to support you. And then eventually in the future, although we can't do this during a crisis, is to find the new donors. Now, as I've said, I've had great success as of late taking people who are hanging out on Facebook pages of some of their favorite charities. Some groups have had 2,000, 3,000 followers or likes, and I'm saying, oh my goodness, how can we convert some of this potential into donors? And we have been doing that through strategies. So I hope that answers Penny's questions. And if Penny, you can just type into the chat box what that approach was, and during our final Q&A session, I want to see what that is so we can talk a little bit more about that. How's that sound?
Sounds like a great idea, Robin.
All
I also
right.
had Susanna, who just had a quick question. She'd like to know the link for the animal sanctuary that you talked about. So you can go
Okay.
check it out on Facebook.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's okay. It's in the United States, and it's in the state of Massachusetts, and it's called the Unity Farm Sanctuary. You will see Kathy. She does live Facebooks every single day, and she puts her donate link there. If you have problems finding it, I can send out that link
Cool.
to folks. But she has brought in close to 70 new donors in this past month alone. Wow. Just by that Facebook conversion.
Nice.
So it is possible, Penny. Unity Farm Sanctuary. Any other questions, Natalie?
That was it for now. Thank you, Robin.
We'll keep rolling. All right, we're moving into our last section here. So what does the fundraising landscape look like from here on out? There's 3 horizons for planning. There's number 1, deal with what we have on the table right now. Build capacity, like Penny's saying, for the future through planning, right? Like, okay, so we know some of our weak spots. We're a small organization, have a limited donor base. We don't have as much time, or actually we have less time now. How do we find those leverage areas and capitalize on the best strategy for our organization, and invest in development and prepare for eventual recovery and even growth? So again, here's the 4 phases. So we're moving from the bump to the slump, the surge, and new normal. Now the goal of the slump, right? I think we're headed into the slump. Here is what I recommend the goal should be. Maximize your income in the short run and preserve your capacity for renewed growth once economic conditions improve. So maximizing your income right now as we're coming out of the bump, and certainly kind of preserving that capacity for growth once things start to get on the mend. So here's some recessionary fundraising practices that I would recommend that you use going into the slump. So as I keep mentioning, we're doing another webinar on fundraising strategy. If you do not have a fundraising strategy in place, a plan for your fundraising growth, this is the time to ensure that you have a fundraising strategy and marketing and communications as well, so that you're working at your highest optimal effectiveness. Your case for support or your messaging. That's why I'm curious to hear what the message was from the groups that Penny was referring to. But make sure that your case is not about you. It's about make it emotional and compelling. Don't be attracted to the shiny new objects, right? Like, oh, we just heard about this particular piece. You know, fundraising is fundraising. We've done it the same way for the last, I don't know, 100 years or so that philanthropy has been in existence. Go with the tried and true methods. And all of this really points to focusing, right? Like here we go, Penny. Focusing more time, effort, and money on the generous and responsive donors and less effort on less productive ones. And move away from that blanket approach of solicitation. Have a tiered approach. During the slump, you know, you may not be asking as much as you are during the bump, but certainly be attentive. This is the time when you should be showing your donors lots of love and care, right? You want to show them that they matter and that they're having an impact and that their gifts are making a difference. And certainly, as we've all learned, we need to move into the digital world. Online is where it's at. It's where we've all had to kind of pivot rather quickly. And this will pay dividends in the future because it certainly is a low cost and cost efficient way of new donor acquisition in many different ways, as well as donor retention and stewardship, or as you see, donor care, right? We already talked about the importance of an investment in regular giving or reoccurring giving to have that monthly stream of income to weather these storms. And certainly do not stop asking, even though we are in the slump. You can still ask for that. Now, what about, let's go back here, phase 3, the surge and new normal. Well, here are the things that I'm recommending. Better board governance, right? Focus on good governance, strong boards of directors. And I know I'm probably hearing, oh no, not that word, boards of directors or words, right? But yes, good board governance, focusing on diversification, connections, networks, diversity of boards, ensuring that you have all the skills and experiences that you need on your boards, including financial management, fundraising, and strategy planning. Having a plan for the future, a strategic plan. Yes, both probably an organizational business strategic plan and a fundraising strategic plan or strategy. So what will your organization look like post-pandemic, and what will be changed? Remember, I said change, not pivot. Let's take things into the future with us that will, you know, really change the way that we've been doing things. So I'm an optimist and a realist at the same time. So I say, okay, don't waste a crisis. We're in it, you know, we're learning things from it. What can we take? What are opportunities, and what can we take now into the future? So really rethink whole areas of what you've been doing and how you've been doing it, right? Like, so Penny, how can we do donor acquisition? Because we know that's a weak spot, right? So let's think about how we can focus some of our energies and planning on that. And certainly phase 2, the slump, and phase 3 are good opportunities to really pause and reflect so that when everything gets to the new normal, we're ready to go. So be adaptable, be innovative, emerge stronger through this crisis through strategy planning and strategic planning, and have resilience. That's what we all need at the moment. And then remember, again, as we were mentioning earlier, this whole sector of volunteering may be very different. I don't know, but it may drop off, partly because of social distancing. Some of our volunteers are on the older side, partly because of the economic impact that will reduce a volunteer's capacity to help. But what we know is some people believe that many of those who've lost their jobs or had an epiphany during their isolation will embrace volunteering as a way of finding new meaning in their life. So that could be an end result of this as well. But we don't know. It's too certain to say on the volunteering aspect of it. And we don't have the bump, the slump, and everything else to project that as we do for giving patents for volunteering. You know, government, you have both in Australia and New Zealand, government are very involved in the sector, not so much in America, but certainly they may become greater involved in the sector in terms of increasing their support, maybe outsourcing some of their functions to the charity sector and rethinking the sector, not just but how it can be a spark for the sector in terms of change and innovation. So my clarion call is, and look, I have my name associated with that, greater funding diversification. So I say, and this is my quote, while fundraising diversification has always been a much talked about need, I hope that as we move out of the pandemic times that organizations will adopt the clarion call to diversify. It is those groups who have been solely reliant on grants and foundations and special events to carry them that are now most vulnerable. Even so-called alternative methods to philanthropy like social enterprise that are quite common in other countries, such as social enterprise, are themselves taking a hit during these pandemic times. Social enterprises not only lost revenues, but also jobs for the very vulnerable clients that we serve. So greater diversification, building broader donor bases, right? Remember the donor pyramid, upgrading your donors through that pyramid so that they're always, you're always asking for greater and greater gifts from the donor. Tending to donor loyalty, retention rates are poor traditionally, and asking for donors' gifts, right? And then, you know, I'm a big advocate for less of an emphasis on special events, and this has certainly panned out to be the case now with what's happened with the pandemic. Many of them just cannot go on. And one of the things that I saw with my clients is if you don't have a CRM system or wherever you're keeping data, that it needs to be clean and up to date. We just could not pivot quick enough with bad data. It was just not possible to go through and clean out data during a pandemic, during one of the, you know, some of the first few weeks of the pandemic. And certainly digital techniques by virtue of necessity have taken front and center. And certainly, you know, boards of directors will need to start looking at building reserves, you know, and possibly even things like, and this doesn't even happen in America, but endowment funds and those kinds of things. But at least having a strong enough reserve to weather rainy days. Now, this is a storm. It's not a rainy day, but you know what I mean. And certainly, will we continue this move to a more virtual, remote, and outsourced world? And what will that mean for our not-for-profits? You know, here is a great quote. If you've, this is a group out of the US called the Veritas Group. Google them, subscribe to their blogs. I highly recommend it. It's one of the best blogs I've ever read, and I read it every day. But what they have said is that there's another word that keeps coming up in this crisis: pivot. Everyone is recommending pivoting. All that is good to except pivoting implies that once this crisis is over, it's okay to go back to what you were doing before. Instead, this crisis gives us all an opportunity. This is an opportunity to permanently change how we evaluate performance, and they put in major gift fundraising, but I'm going to say in all fundraising and in life. And if we change how we evaluate performance, we change how we do fundraising, right? And diversifying your revenue streams could come at a cost. We know that organizations that want to change their culture and invest in mid-major and planned giving programs run up against internal forces that don't like change. Change isn't easy, but it will be necessary for the health of your organization. Whew, I came in 2 minutes under, so what did you learn? A lot, right? I shared with you what is happening today. We talked about some of the key learnings from the bushfire crisis, although that was a disaster that impacted, relatively few in comparison to what is happening with the pandemic. And the all-important, what is motivating donors to give today? Because that's so important to know. Why are donors giving, and why are they giving to such a great extent? What can we expect? What should we be doing? And my hypotheses around what may happen in the very near future after we get through this bump, the slump, and into a new normal. Wow. So if you don't have any questions, now I'm going to turn it back to Natalie to say, are there any more questions? But feel free to type into the chat box, was this helpful? How will you take this back and, have a COVID fundraising strategy, or maybe even just share what your greatest, what I call aha moment is from our time today. Here we are.
I just give the hospital a ring. 300 on my clock. Okay.
There we are. I've accidentally unmuted everyone without announcing it. Maybe you can turn your video back on, Robin. I don't see any more questions coming up in the chat. I like the idea always of evaluating for effective being. Thought of ideas that could be taken to relevant people in organizations. A lot of info to process. So I think, yeah, the faces graph was super useful. Thanks for today. So we're getting a lot of positive feedback in here. Robin, are you still there?
Oops. Can you hear me, Natalie?
Yes, now I can, I can see you.
Perfect. Perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. So someone's asking, when is the next workshop? So we've got a fundraising strategy workshop. It's a 3-hour workshop with Robin. That's happening on the 3rd of June, and there's still a few places available for that. I'll put the link in the email that we're sending out later today. Yeah, thank you very much. Very informative. It was great. Many thanks, food for thought. I think people really appreciated it. So
yeah, well, it's a firsthand experience. I don't know if I said this. I have 40 coaching clients, all small nonprofits, pretty much with budgets anywhere from, 25,000 to 500,000 or maybe even more. But this is all really learned experience from my time in the last 2 months coaching them. So that's why so much passion came through, and I really didn't have to look at the slides to talk about it because I've been living it for the last 2 months. It's been incredible. It's been quite a ride.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, I don't see any more questions coming through. People are very appreciative. So we're going to close it off then today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for Zooming with us. And yeah, as I can see, lots to think about. Thank you so much. It's great that you all joined us, and we definitely hope that you can use this as an inspiration. And as I mentioned before, I'll send the slides because Robin has very kindly shared the slides with us. and we'll put the recording up on YouTube and Facebook as well. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.